My name is Lily. And for a long time, that was all anyone thought I was, just a name on an intern badge. In this company, titles decided your worth. Executives spoke. Managers nodded. And interns stayed quiet, took notes, and tried not to be noticed. That's what they expected from me. They didn't see intelligence when I asked questions. They didn't hear strategy when I stayed silent. They saw someone temporary, replaceable, harmless. Especially him. One senior executive made it his routine to remind me that I was just an intern. He mocked my role in meetings, laughed at my suggestions, and treated my presence like a joke. The room followed his lead. What none of them understood was this simple truth. Power doesn't always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes, it sits quietly, taking notes. I had access they didn't worry about. Documents they skimmed. Records they signed without reading. And one day, buried in all that ignored paperwork, I found something that changed everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront him. I followed the rules better than he ever did. And when the time came, I used the one authority they forgot an intern could have. I called a shareholder meeting. By the time they realized who I really was, his career was already over. In large corporations, perception matters more than truth. What people think you are decides how they treat you, long before they ever learn what you can do. On my first day, I learned that lesson quietly. The office was everything people imagine when they think of power. Glass walls, polished floors, low voices speaking in confident tones. Everyone walked fast, like time itself belonged to them. Titles floated in the air like invisible shields. Director, Vice President, Executive. And then there was me. An intern. Temporary badge. Shared desk. No authority. At least, that's how it looked. My role was simple on paper. Observe, assist, take notes. No opinions requested. No decisions expected. I was there to learn. And I did. I learned who spoke first in meetings and who waited. I learned which executives demanded attention and which quietly controlled outcomes. I learned how people changed their tone depending on who entered the room. Most importantly, I learned who underestimated whom. The first meeting I attended was a senior leadership briefing. I wasn't supposed to speak, just record minutes. I sat at the far end of the table, laptop open, eyes down. That's when I noticed him. Victor Hale. Senior Executive Vice President. Expensive suit. Relaxed confidence. The kind of man who never doubted his own importance. He didn't acknowledge me at first. That came later, when he noticed me typing. He paused mid-sentence, looked down the table, and smirked. "Is the intern keeping up?" he asked. Light laughter followed. Not cruel. Not kind. Just automatic. I kept typing. From that moment on, I became a background detail he enjoyed pointing out. A joke. A reminder of hierarchy. He called me kid. Asked if I understood how real business works. Once suggested I grab coffee in the middle of a discussion. During a meeting I was officially assigned to document. No one stopped him. Why would they? He was powerful. I was temporary. What they didn't see was what I saw. Executives like Victor didn't read documents carefully. They skimmed summaries. They trusted systems built by others. And interns touched everything no one else wanted to look at. Emails copied for reference. Drafts marked low priority. Meeting attachments no one opened. I had access without scrutiny. That's the irony of underestimation. It creates blind spots. Day by day, I learned the company's internal rhythm. Which approvals were routine. Which signatures carried weight. Which departments quietly cleaned up mistakes made higher up. Victor appeared confident because he delegated consequences downward. When numbers looked good, he took credit. When something felt risky, he waved it through with charm and urgency. "Let's not overcomplicate things," he liked to say. People nodded. I didn't. But I didn't argue either. Interns who argue disappear. So I listened. I noticed how Victor spoke differently to shareholders than to staff. How he promised stability while quietly pushing aggressive decisions through internal channels. How he relied on the assumption that no one would challenge him, especially not someone without a title. One afternoon, after a meeting, he stopped by my desk. "Make sure the minutes don't slow us down," he said casually. "We don't need unnecessary detail." It sounded harmless. It wasn't. Minutes weren't just notes. They were records. Legal memory. I nodded, and documented everything precisely. Over time, people stopped noticing me. That was the goal. When you're invisible, you hear things meant only for the powerful. Conversations that assume no consequences. Victor once joked with another executive about how shareholders never read past the headline. They laughed. I wrote it down. Another time, he approved a report without opening the attachment. I noticed because I had prepared the attachment. No one asked whether interns understood the work. No one checked what interns remembered. They didn't realize that every mockery made me more patient. Every dismissal made me more careful. Power doesn't rush when it's building something permanent. Weeks passed. Then months. Victor's behavior escalated, not aggressively, but comfortably. Like someone who had never been questioned long enough to believe he never would be. He interrupted others freely. Dismissed concerns as overthinking. Reduced governance to inconvenience. And every time he spoke, people deferred. Because challenging him required confidence. And confidence required safety. I had neither. But I had something else. Time. Interns weren't expected to stay. That assumption made people careless. They forgot interns leave, but documents remain. They forgot temporary roles still touch permanent systems. They forgot that learning doesn't stop at titles. By the end of my internship's first phase, I knew more about the company's internal structure than most junior managers. Not because I was smarter. Because I was ignored. Victor never saw me as a threat. To him, I was furniture with a laptop. And that mistake, that single assumption, was already shaping the end of his career. He just didn't know it yet. Mockery in corporate offices rarely sounds cruel. It's polished, smiling, wrapped in humor. That's what makes it dangerous. Victor Hale never raised his voice. He never shouted or insulted me directly. What he did was worse. He turned condescension into entertainment. In meetings, he would pause after speaking, glance in my direction, and say things like, "Let's make sure this is simple enough for everyone." Or, "I don't want to overwhelm our junior observers." People laughed because laughter was safe. I learned quickly that humiliation didn't need volume. It just needed an audience. Every comment reinforced the same message. I didn't belong in that room. I was lucky to even be allowed there. And once people accept that idea, they stop guarding themselves around you. Victor treated me like background noise. He spoke freely when I was present, about numbers, shortcuts, assumptions. He once joked that compliance rules were guidelines, not handcuffs. Another executive laughed and added, "As long as no one important is watching." They didn't consider me important. That belief shaped everything. My responsibilities grew quietly. Not upward, but outward. I was asked to organize internal documents, archive investor communications, prepare summaries that executives didn't have time to read. That last part mattered. I handled material others skimmed. Historical voting records, proxy assignments, approval logs stretching back years. Work no one wanted, but work everything depended on. Victor mocked interns because he believed interns had no memory. No context. No authority. He never considered access. One afternoon, during a quarterly review, I raised a neutral question. Not a challenge, just clarification. Victor leaned back in his chair and smiled. "That's adorable," he said. "Curiosity is good. But let's leave strategy to people with experience." The room laughed again. I nodded. What no one noticed was the CFO's reaction, a flicker of discomfort. He knew the question had been valid. But no one corrected Victor. Silence protected hierarchy. After that, I stopped asking questions out loud. Instead, I asked them privately, through documents. I compared reports Victor presented to shareholders with internal drafts. They weren't identical. Language had been softened. Risks minimized. Timelines shifted. Nothing blatantly illegal. Just flexible. And flexibility, when repeated often enough, becomes policy. Victor relied on momentum. He spoke fast, moved faster, and pushed decisions through while people were still processing the last one. Delay kills deals, he liked to say. That phrase appeared often in his emails. So did his name, at the bottom of approval chains. What made Victor dangerous wasn't arrogance. It was confidence without accountability. He believed rules existed to serve leadership, not restrain it. And leadership, in his mind, was defined by title. I watched him dominate rooms where others hesitated. I watched senior managers defer to him even when they disagreed. Not because he was always right. Because challenging him carried consequences. Interns didn't challenge anyone. Which made me invisible. That invisibility gave me time to notice patterns. Victor often approved investor-facing material late at night. Quick replies. Minimal comments. He trusted that teams below him had handled details. Sometimes they had. Sometimes they hadn't. And when mistakes surfaced, they were corrected quietly, downward. I noticed something else. Whenever shareholder votes were mentioned, Victor dismissed them as formalities. Votes always pass, he said once. If they didn't, we'd already be out of business. That sentence stayed with me. Because votes only always pass when someone assumes they will. As part of my assignment, I began organizing shareholder meeting minutes from previous years. Most interns would have skimmed. I didn't. I compared attendance records to voting outcomes. Noticed gaps. Proxy votes submitted without clear authorization trails. Again, nothing loud. Nothing obvious. Just inconsistencies that relied on no one asking questions. Victor's mockery increased as his confidence grew. He once introduced me to a visiting consultant as our note-taking prodigy. Another time, he asked if I was planning to graduate to real work soon. I smiled every time. Because mockery makes people predictable. Predictable people reuse habits. Reuse shortcuts. Repeat mistakes. Victor never checked who handled what, as long as outcomes favored him. He assumed interns rotated out before patterns could be noticed. He assumed memory required authority. He was wrong. By the time he stopped paying attention to me entirely, I knew his schedule better than he did. I knew when approvals were rushed. When pressure was highest. When oversight was weakest. I also knew this. The company trusted him because no one had ever slowed him down. And the one group with enough time to notice was the one he dismissed. Mockery didn't make me smaller. It made me patient. And patience, in systems built on momentum, is quietly disruptive. Victor thought interns existed to observe leadership. In reality, leadership was teaching me exactly how it would fall. The assignment came quietly. No announcement. No urgency. Just an email forwarded late in the evening with a single line. Can the intern clean this up? This turned out to be a forgotten corner of the company. Investor relations archives. Old reports. Shareholder correspondence. Voting records no one had reviewed in years. It was the kind of work that lived in digital dust. Too boring for managers. Too detailed for executives. Perfect for someone no one was watching. The files were messy. Folders within folders. Documents labeled inconsistently, sometimes not labeled at all. At first glance, it looked like pure admin work. It wasn't. Investor relations wasn't just communication. It was control. Every vote, every proxy, every approval tied back to these records. This was where decisions became legitimate. And legitimacy, once broken, never heals quietly. I started organizing chronologically. Year by year. Meeting by meeting. That's when the first irregularity appeared. A shareholder vote approved in the minutes. But missing corresponding attendance confirmation. Not alarming by itself. Mistakes happen. But then another. And another. Patterns don't announce themselves. They whisper. Proxy votes are signed automatically. Shareholders marked present despite no record of participation. Decisions passed unanimously, on paper. The approvals were clean. Too clean. Every one of them traced back to executive authorization. Victor's name appeared often. Sometimes directly. Sometimes through delegated authority. Always upstream. I didn't jump to conclusions. That's how people get fired. Instead, I cross-checked. Emails. Calendar invites. Internal memos. The more I aligned timelines, the clearer it became. Certain shareholder groups were consistently absent from discussions. Yet their votes were always counted. Not forged. Not stolen. Assumed. Victor operated on momentum. If no one objected, he treated silence as consent. That approach worked, until someone checked. And no one ever did. Why would they? Investor relations was handled. That word again. Handled. The deeper I went, the more I understood why this project had been abandoned. It wasn't just boring. It was dangerous. Fixing it meant asking questions no one wanted answered. Questions that pointed upward. So the project lived with interns. Temporary people. Safe people. I spent days mapping voting rights to actual confirmations. Highlighting gaps. Not correcting, just observing. At night, I reviewed company bylaws. Not casually. Line by line. Buried inside procedural language was a section few executives ever read. It outlined responsibilities for record accuracy and escalation. And it named a role. Investor Documentation Liaison. A technical designation. Low status. Administrative. Assigned automatically to whoever handled records. That role had authority. Not loud authority. Process authority. The right to flag irregularities. The right to request review. The right, under specific conditions, to escalate concerns directly to shareholders. It wasn't designed for interns. It was designed for systems. Victor didn't respect systems. He used them. And because he assumed no one would challenge the records, he never checked who controlled them. During a weekly meeting, someone mentioned the archive cleanup. Victor waved it off. Let the intern handle it, he said. Nothing critical there. That sentence locked everything into place. If it wasn't critical, no one would supervise. If no one supervised, no one would interfere. I continued quietly. Every document I touched, I logged. Every inconsistency, I noted. Not accusations. Observations. The kind that stand up under scrutiny. I didn't store anything externally. I followed policy perfectly. That mattered. Because the strongest leverage isn't hidden evidence. It's compliant evidence. Weeks passed. Victor's behavior didn't change. If anything, he grew more relaxed. He joked openly about rubber stamp votes. About how shareholders trusted leadership to decide for them. He said it like wisdom. What it really was complacency. The project neared completion. My cleanup report was ready. Neat. Organized. Neutral. I submitted it as requested. No commentary. No conclusions. Just facts. No one responded. That silence told me everything. They didn't want the work done. They wanted it buried. But it was too late for that. The records were now clean enough to be read. Clear enough to be understood. Structured enough to reveal patterns. And once patterns exist, they can't be unseen. Victor believed the project meant nothing. In reality, it was the foundation of everything he stood on. He thought interns handled leftovers. He never imagined leftovers could bring down the table. At first, I did what I was supposed to do. I reported the findings the way policy required, calmly, clearly, and without emotion. No accusations. No dramatic language. Just a concise summary of inconsistencies and a suggestion for review. I sent it up the chain, copied the appropriate departments, and waited. Nothing happened. Days passed with no acknowledgement. No follow-up questions. No request for clarification. The silence wasn't confusion, it was dismissal. I began to understand how this place really worked. Problems weren't solved here. They were weighed. And if fixing them threatened someone powerful enough, they were simply ignored. During a leadership meeting the following week, I heard my work mentioned in passing. Not by name. Not seriously. An intern flagged some noise in the archives, someone said with a laugh. Victor waved a hand. Housekeeping issues. Already handled. Already handled. The phrase was familiar now. It meant nothing would change. I sat there, typing minutes, watching the room move on. No one asked what the inconsistencies were. No one wanted details. A few people glanced in my direction, then looked away, relieved they didn't have to engage. That was the moment I stopped trying to be heard. Not because I was afraid. Because I finally understood the rules. Speaking without leverage was pointless. So I adjusted. I reread every policy related to investor documentation, escalation procedures, and shareholder rights. Not once, many times. Slowly, carefully. I looked for process, not punishment. Authority that didn't rely on permission. That's when the structure became clear. The company didn't empower individuals. It empowered procedures. And procedures didn't care about titles. As the assigned handler of investor records, responsibility for accuracy sat with me by default. That role carried obligations and rights, including the right to escalate concerns if irregularities affected shareholder representation. Not suspicion. Not intent. Representation. That distinction mattered. I documented everything again, this time mapping each inconsistency to its procedural impact. Which votes were affected? Which decisions relied on those votes? Which approvals assumed legitimacy that hadn't been verified? I didn't speculate. I didn't interpret motive. I let the structure speak. Meanwhile, Victor grew more comfortable. His confidence spilled into recklessness. He cut people off mid-sentence. Dismissed compliance reminders as paralysis. Treated governance like a speed bump. And because no one challenged him, he assumed no one could. I noticed how executives deferred automatically when he spoke. How meetings bent around his schedule. How decisions followed his rhythm. Power loves quiet obedience. I stopped reacting to the jokes. Stopped correcting the tone. I became exactly what they expected. Silent, efficient, forgettable. But beneath that invisibility, I prepared. Every document I touched followed protocol. Every action aligned with policy. Nothing impulsive. Nothing emotional. Because whatever happened next had to be unbreakable. The company had ignored the warning. Victor had dismissed the risk. That left only one path forward. Not confrontation. Not exposure. Escalation. And escalation didn't begin with noise. It began with patience. When the time came, no one would be able to say they hadn't been warned. They would only be forced to admit they hadn't listened. Once I stopped trying to be heard internally, everything became clearer. The company didn't fear mistakes. It feared exposure. Internal warnings could be ignored, softened, or buried. But shareholders were different. They weren't managed day-to-day. They weren't part of office politics. They were power without proximity. And that made them dangerous. My work shifted from identifying problems to understanding impact. Not what was wrong, but who it affected. Shareholders weren't a single group. They were institutions, funds, individuals, each with different voting rights, thresholds, and expectations. Some had delegated authority through proxies. Others required direct notice for specific decisions. On paper, the system looked airtight. In practice, it relied heavily on assumption. Assumption that emails were read. Assumption that silence meant approval. Assumption that no one would ever audit the process from the ground up. That assumption had become habit. I started reconstructing decision timelines from the shareholders' perspective instead of the company's. What were they told? When were they told? What did they actually vote on? The answers were incomplete. Not fraudulent. Not fabricated. Incomplete. Which was worse. Because incomplete information invalidated consent. Some shareholders received summaries instead of full disclosures. Others were notified after internal deadlines had already passed. In several cases, proxy votes were submitted under standard authorization without confirming whether that authorization still applied. It was all technically defensible, if no one asked questions. Victor counted on that. He treated shareholder approval as a formality, not a dialogue. A step to clear, not a responsibility to honor. The deeper I went, the more I realized how normalized this behavior had become. Teams downstream followed precedent. Precedent followed momentum. Momentum followed Victor. No single decision was explosive. But together, they formed a pattern of governance erosion. And patterns are what regulators and shareholders care about. I began categorizing the inconsistencies. Not by severity, but by exposure. Which decisions required re-notification if challenged? Which votes could be disputed? Which approvals lacked defensible audit trails? The list grew longer than I expected. What surprised me most wasn't the scale, it was how easy it had been. No hacking. No secrecy. No deception. Just neglect, confidence, and speed. I thought back to Victor's jokes about shareholders never reading past headlines. About votes always passing. That mindset had shaped everything. One evening, while cross-checking proxy documentation, I noticed something subtle but critical. A major institutional shareholder had a standing limitation clause. Any vote involving restructuring above a certain threshold required explicit confirmation. That confirmation wasn't in the records. Yet their vote had been counted. Not guessed. Not faked. Assumed. I traced the approval chain. Victor had signed off on the summary distribution. Someone below him had marked the proxy as covered. No one had verified. That single assumption affected millions in voting weight. I leaned back from my screen and let the realization settle. This wasn't about one executive being arrogant. It was about a system that had learned to skip steps because skipping steps had never been punished. Until now. I didn't rush. Rushing creates mistakes. Mistakes create excuses. Instead, I double-checked everything. Then checked it again. I consulted policy interpretations. Reviewed legal commentary attached to the bylaws. Verified escalation language. The clause was clear. If shareholder representation was compromised due to procedural irregularities, the assigned liaison had the right and obligation to escalate the issue for correction. Not discretion. Obligation. Ignoring it would make me complicit. That mattered. I wasn't preparing a move anymore. I was fulfilling a duty. Meanwhile, Victor remained blissfully unaware. He strutted through meetings with the ease of someone who had never been slowed down. He spoke confidently about future initiatives, expansion plans, leadership vision. All built on the assumption that the foundation beneath him was solid. No one corrected him. Why would they? To do so meant admitting the system had failed. And systems never fail in boardrooms. People do. I watched executives exchange looks when shareholder topics came up. Quick glances. Unspoken agreement to move on. They didn't want to know. Not knowing kept them safe. I started drafting a neutral internal memo, not to send, but to organize my thoughts. It outlined the risks from a shareholder perspective. Not blame. Exposure. Language mattered. This wasn't about accusing Victor of wrongdoing. It was about documenting that shareholder rights had not been fully respected. That framing changed everything. Because once shareholder rights are in question, authority shifts automatically. Late one night, I checked the calendar. The next scheduled shareholder meeting was months away. Too far. But the bylaws allowed for special meetings under specific conditions. Procedural irregularities affecting representation qualified. The request didn't require executive approval. It required documentation. I already had that. I didn't submit anything yet. I wasn't ready. There was still one thing I needed to be sure of. I needed to confirm that escalation would land exactly where it was supposed to. Not inside the company, but above it. So I reviewed historical cases, past shareholder escalations, how they had unfolded. Every successful one shared a common trait. They were boring. No emotion. No outrage. Just undeniable process failure. I understood now why Victor mocked interns. Because interns were assumed to be emotional. Reactive. Eager to prove something. What he never accounted for was patience. And patience had given me something far more powerful than anger. It had given me clarity. By the time I shut down my computer that night, the decision had already been made. The question was no longer if this would move to shareholders. It was when. And more importantly, how little noise it would make until it was too late to stop. Power doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly, usually through paperwork no one wants to read. The first thing I did was slow down even more. That sounds counterintuitive, especially when you know you're holding something explosive. But speed is the easiest way to give power back to the wrong people. I wasn't trying to expose anyone yet. I was trying to make the system speak for itself. The escalation clause sat deep inside the governance framework, surrounded by language so dry most people skipped it entirely. It wasn't written to be dramatic. It was written to be unavoidable. The company prided itself on compliance culture, training sessions, certifications, annual acknowledgements, which meant one thing. Once the clause was triggered, ignoring it would contradict everything leadership claimed to stand for. That contradiction mattered more than any accusation ever could. I spent days preparing the escalation packet, not because it was complicated, but because it had to be boring. No emotional language. No opinions. No speculation. Just timelines, discrepancies, and references. Every page answered a single question. Was shareholder consent properly informed at the time of vote? And again, the answer came back incomplete. Not malicious. Not reckless. Incomplete. That word did the work for me. Before submitting anything, I walked through the internal escalation flow one last time. Not to use it, but to understand how leadership expected problems to be handled. Step 1. Notify direct manager. Step 2. Escalate to compliance liaison. Step 3. Executive review. Each step assumed cooperation. Each step assumed good faith. None of them applied here. Because this wasn't an operational issue. It was a governance issue. And governance doesn't belong to executives. It belongs to shareholders. That distinction was subtle, but it changed jurisdiction entirely. I prepared 2 versions of the documentation. One internal. One external. The internal version was deliberately restrained. It flagged procedural gaps without naming consequences. The external version cited the bylaws directly and referenced shareholder rights language verbatim. Only one of them would ever be sent. I waited. Timing mattered more than content. Victor was preparing for a leadership summit, his favorite environment. Panels. Speeches. Visibility. He was distracted, surrounded by affirmation and applause. That was not the moment to act. You never confront someone when they're watching the crowd. You confront them when they're convinced the crowd is already on their side. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A routine internal announcement went out about an upcoming strategic adjustment. Nothing major, nothing alarming. But buried inside it was a reference to an approval that hadn't actually been finalized correctly. They were moving forward as if consent already existed. That was my trigger. Because now the issue wasn't historical. It was active. Proceeding under assumed authorization after discovering a discrepancy created liability, not just exposure. That changed everything. I finalized the escalation request. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse. It didn't threaten. It requested clarification. Clarification of whether shareholder representation had been fully honored prior to execution. That's all. The system did the rest. The request didn't go to Victor. It didn't go to legal. It didn't go to my department. It went to the shareholder governance channel, an entity so detached from daily operations most employees forgot it existed. Within hours, acknowledgement arrived. Not approval. Not rejection. Acknowledgement. That single word meant the process had begun. From that moment on, control no longer belonged to the executive floor. It belonged to procedure. Victor didn't notice at first. Why would he? Nothing changed outwardly. Meetings continued. Emails flowed. Plans advanced. But behind the scenes, requests started appearing. Quiet ones. Verification of proxy authority. Confirmation of disclosure completeness. Revalidation of vote thresholds. These weren't accusations. They were questions. And questions are dangerous in systems built on assumption. The compliance team began asking for documents they hadn't reviewed in years. Legal started cross-checking language they normally took at face value. No alarms were raised. No alerts sent. Just slow, methodical review. I watched it unfold without participating. That was important. The moment I became visible, the story would shift from process to person. And this couldn't be about a person. Victor eventually sensed something. I noticed it in the way he started asking sharper questions in meetings. In how his tone shifted when approvals were mentioned. He wasn't worried yet. Just irritated. I heard his voice carry down the hallway one afternoon, dismissive and confident, saying something about overcautious governance types slowing things down. That told me everything I needed to know. He still believed authority flowed downward. He didn't realize it had already moved sideways, and then up. A week later, the request came. A formal notice for clarification had been issued to select shareholders regarding prior votes. Not all of them. Just enough. That detail mattered. Selective clarification avoided panic while still activating rights. It was surgical. Victor was notified only after the notices were sent. Not before. By then, it was irreversible. I wasn't in the room when he found out, but I didn't need to be. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Meetings were postponed. Agendas rewritten. Language softened. Words like final disappeared. Replaced by proposed, pending, subject to confirmation. That's what authority loss looks like, not collapse, but hesitation. The summit was quietly downgraded. Victor's keynote became a panel appearance. A small change. But symbolic. Executives began distancing themselves, not openly, but strategically. Emails started including more people. Decisions required more signatures. No one said his name. They didn't have to. The system was doing what systems do when risk becomes visible. It contained. One afternoon, I received a neutral request from governance asking for additional documentation. No urgency. No pressure. Just procedure. I sent what they asked for. Nothing more. Nothing less. That was the hardest part, not adding commentary. Because commentary invites debate. And debate gives powerful people something to push against. Facts don't. By the end of the second week, the narrative had fully shifted. This was no longer about whether approvals had been mishandled. It was about whether leadership had adequately safeguarded shareholder representation. That question doesn't have a quick answer. And it doesn't favor charisma. It favors caution. Victor was suddenly very quiet. No jokes. No confident speeches. Just carefully worded updates. I passed him in the hallway once. He didn't look angry. He looked confused. That mattered more. Because anger looks for enemies. Confusion looks for explanations. And explanations, when they exist on paper, don't lie. By the time the formal special meeting was mentioned, not scheduled, just mentioned, his career trajectory had already changed. He just didn't know it yet. I did. And I understood something then that no one had ever taught me. You don't end careers by attacking people. You end them by letting the rules they ignored finally apply to them. The moment the word special shareholder meeting entered internal circulation, everything changed. Not officially. Not publicly. But structurally. Up until then, the situation still lived in a grey zone, reviews, clarifications, confirmations. Those were manageable. They could be framed as diligence, as caution, as temporary friction. A special meeting was different. A special meeting meant the normal flow of authority had been suspended. It meant shareholders, not executives, would decide the next step. And most importantly, it meant the narrative would no longer be controlled by confidence or hierarchy, but by documentation. Victor felt it before anyone said it out loud. He started appearing in places he never had before. Compliance check-ins, legal briefings, governance syncs he used to ignore. His presence was polite, measured, almost humble. But it was obvious he was trying to reinsert himself into a process that no longer revolved around him. He asked questions that sounded reasonable on the surface. How long does this typically take? Is this level of review really necessary? Can we streamline without compromising standards? No one answered directly. Because no one could. Once the mechanism had been triggered, there was no streamlining. There was only completion. I stayed exactly where I was. That mattered. People often think power shifts happen when someone steps forward. In reality, they happen when someone doesn't. I didn't attend meetings I wasn't invited to. I didn't volunteer insights unless asked. I didn't react when tension filled the room. I remained operational. That consistency made it impossible to frame me as a disruptor. Meanwhile, Victor began building a narrative. Not publicly, quietly. I heard fragments through overlapping calendars and forwarded emails. He was positioning the issue as an overinterpretation. A technicality. A misunderstanding blown out of proportion by process-heavy teams detached from business realities. It was a smart move. But it relied on one assumption. That the facts were flexible. They weren't. The governance review team operated independently, insulated from internal politics by design. Their job wasn't to weigh intent or performance. It was to answer one question. Were shareholders properly represented? That question had a yes or no core, even if the path to answering it was complex. As documents moved across their desks, patterns emerged. Small gaps on their own, timing mismatches, incomplete disclosures, proxy language that leaned just slightly too vague. Individually, none of it was fatal. Together, it painted a picture of decisions made faster than consent could reasonably follow. That picture didn't accuse anyone. But it demanded explanation. Victor tried to get ahead of it. He circulated a memo reframing past decisions as time-sensitive, necessary actions taken under market pressure. He emphasized growth, shareholder value, strategic urgency. The language was polished. But it missed the point. Urgency doesn't replace authorization. Performance doesn't negate process. And governance frameworks are intentionally indifferent to success. They only care whether the rules were followed. The special meeting was formally scheduled 2 weeks later. Not announced broadly, just notified to qualifying shareholders. That detail mattered. The meeting wasn't about spectacle. It was about jurisdiction. As preparations began, Victor's allies started pulling back. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Just subtly. Calendar conflicts appeared. Delegation replaced attendance. Statements grew non-committal. No one wanted to be on record defending something that might soon be questioned under oath. Victor noticed. He became sharper in private conversations, more controlled in public ones. His confidence shifted into precision. Every word chosen. Every sentence hedged. I crossed paths with him more than once during that period. He never spoke to me directly. That told me he knew. Not everything, but enough. The closer the meeting came, the more the company's posture changed. Projects paused. Announcements delayed. Forward-looking statements softened. The organization wasn't panicking. It was bracing. Legal teams prepared briefing materials that avoided naming individuals while outlining scenarios. Compliance drafted contingency plans. Governance finalized agendas that stuck rigidly to scope. No one wanted mission creep. The meeting had one purpose. Determine whether prior approvals met the standard required by the bylaws. That was it. Victor attempted one final maneuver. He requested an internal review summary be shared with him prior to the meeting for alignment. The request was denied, not aggressively, just procedurally. He wasn't entitled to it. That denial landed harder than any accusation could have. Because it signaled something fundamental. He was no longer central to the decision. The night before the meeting, the building felt different. Quieter. Heavier. People worked later than usual but spoke less. Emails were shorter. No jokes. No speculation. Everyone understood that whatever happened next wouldn't be reversible. I reviewed my own role one last time. Everything I had done was documented. Every action traceable. Every step aligned with policy. There was no emotional investment left, just clarity. The meeting itself wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No grand speeches. Shareholders joined remotely, represented by counsel, advisors, and proxies. The agenda was followed exactly. Documents were presented. Questions were asked. And answered. Not defensively. Not emotionally. Just factually. Victor spoke when given the floor. He was composed. Controlled. He acknowledged gaps without conceding fault. Emphasized intent, performance, outcomes. It was a strong presentation. But it wasn't the presentation that mattered. It was the questions that followed. They were calm, precise, unforgiving. Questions about timing. About disclosure language. About assumptions embedded in consent. Each question narrowed the space he could operate in. By the time the final clarification request was issued, formal, recorded, and binding, the outcome was already clear. The prior approvals would need to be re-evaluated. That decision alone didn't end a career. But it did something worse. It suspended credibility. Because once governance determines that oversight failed, responsibility doesn't disappear, it concentrates. The meeting ended without drama. No votes taken yet. No announcements made. But the authority Victor once wielded effortlessly was gone. In the days that followed, interim structures were put in place. Oversight committees formed. External advisors retained. Victor's role was described using careful language. Temporarily recused. Pending review. Non-operational. Words chosen to sound neutral. They weren't. He stopped appearing altogether after that. No meetings. No memos. Just absence. And absence, in corporate life, speaks louder than any termination notice. I returned to my desk the next morning and continued working. Same routines. Same responsibilities. No congratulations. No acknowledgement. That was exactly how it needed to be. Because the story was never about me stepping into the spotlight. It was about proving something far more dangerous. That even the most powerful people are only powerful until the rules they rely on are taken seriously. And now, they were. By the time the word review became permanent language instead of a temporary label, the company had already shifted into a different phase of reality. Reviews change behavior. They don't announce guilt. They don't assign blame. They make people cautious. Every decision slowed. Every approval passed through additional hands. The easy confidence that once powered the executive floor was replaced with measured restraint. This wasn't paralysis. It was self-preservation. Victor's name still appeared on org charts, but it no longer carried gravity. Emails that once demanded immediate response now arrived with softened phrasing. Invitations were replaced with summaries. His presence had become symbolic rather than functional. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. The company was preparing for life after him. External advisors arrived quietly. No press releases. No internal fanfare. Just calendar holds and new email signatures. Governance specialists, forensic reviewers, risk consultants, people whose job was to look backward without emotion. They didn't ask why things happened. They asked how. And more importantly, who knew what, and when. That distinction mattered. Because intent can be debated. Knowledge cannot. The review unfolded in layers. Not all at once. Not dramatically. First came document validation, ensuring that what had been submitted over the years matched what was archived. That process alone exposed inconsistencies in how information had been summarized for decision-makers. Not falsified. Filtered. Language had softened risk. Timelines had been compressed. Context had been selectively emphasized. Nothing illegal on its own. But patterns don't exist by accident. Then came interviews. Not interrogations. Conversations. People were asked to walk through how decisions were made. Who was consulted? How dissent was handled? Whether concerns were documented or resolved informally. Those conversations revealed something important. Many people had noticed gaps. Few had felt empowered to question them. The culture had rewarded speed and alignment. Caution had been framed as obstruction. Victor didn't need to silence anyone. The system had already done that for him. That realization didn't sit comfortably with leadership. Because culture isn't something you can pin on one person. It reflects what behavior is tolerated and what behavior is discouraged. As the review deepened, accountability began to shift away from individuals and toward structures. Processes that had once been considered efficient were now being re-examined as vulnerable. Committees were redefined. Approval thresholds raised. Documentation requirements expanded. Every change was framed as proactive. But everyone knew it was reactive. I was asked to provide context during the review. Not testimony. Not defense. Context. The request came through governance, carefully worded, neutral in tone. They wanted clarity on how records were maintained, how discrepancies were flagged, and how escalation pathways were understood operationally. I answered exactly what was asked. Nothing more. I didn't describe emotions. I didn't narrate intent. I explained steps. Where information came from. Where it went. What happened next. That was enough. Victor's absence became more noticeable as weeks passed. Not because people missed him, but because decisions kept moving without him. Interim leaders filled gaps. Authority redistributed. The company functioned. That realization was devastating in its own way. It proved something no one wanted to admit. He had been influential, but not essential. The board convened separately from management for the first time in years. Their agenda wasn't punitive. It was existential. How had oversight drifted this far without anyone noticing? The answer wasn't comfortable. They had noticed. They just hadn't intervened. Because results had been good. Growth had been strong. Markets had responded positively. And in corporate life, success often anesthetizes risk. The review report took shape slowly. Not as a narrative, but as a map. A map of decisions, approvals, assumptions, and shortcuts. A timeline showing how authority consolidated, how challenge diminished, how speed overtook scrutiny. Victor's name appeared frequently. Not accusatorily. Just factually. He was the common thread. The report didn't recommend immediate termination. That surprised some people. Instead, it outlined risk exposure, governance failures, and corrective actions required to restore shareholder confidence. One of those actions was leadership realignment. Another was accountability assessment. Language designed to sound neutral, but heavy with implication. Victor was notified formally of the findings. I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. What mattered was what followed. His response wasn't public. But the internal effect was immediate. He resigned. Not dramatically. Not defensively. A short announcement. Carefully phrased. Stepping aside to allow the company to move forward. No admissions. No apologies. Just exit. The market reacted mildly. Internally, the reaction was more complex. Relief. Uncertainty. Quiet reckoning. People began re-evaluating moments they had dismissed. Decisions they had nodded through. Silence they had justified. Culture doesn't change overnight. But awareness does. I wasn't promoted. I wasn't recognized publicly. That was intentional. The company didn't want a hero narrative. Heroes create backlash. Instead, structures were reinforced. Policies updated. Oversight expanded. And quietly, my role changed. More access. More responsibility. Still no spotlight. That was fine. Because the outcome had never been about recognition. It had been about proof. Proof that authority doesn't come from volume or confidence. It comes from alignment with systems designed to protect more than egos. Victor had believed control was permanent. The review proved otherwise. And as the company stabilized into its new shape, one truth became impossible to ignore. No matter how high you climb, the rules are always above you. They just wait until someone is patient enough to let them work. After the resignation, the company entered a phase that didn't have a name yet, but everyone felt it. It wasn't recovery. It wasn't celebration. It was recalibration. The absence of a dominant figure doesn't create freedom immediately. It creates uncertainty. People look around, unsure of how loudly to speak, how boldly to decide, how much initiative is safe. For years, direction had flowed through a single lens. Now that lens was gone, and leadership had to relearn how to see collectively. Meetings became slower, not because people were indecisive, but because they were careful. Opinions were offered tentatively. Questions were asked where once there had been silence. The tone of the organization changed. Not dramatically. Gradually. Committees once treated as formalities were now active. Governance sessions were no longer rushed. Legal reviews expanded beyond checklists into conversations. This wasn't inefficiency. It was responsibility returning to its rightful place. The board played a more visible role. Not as overseers reacting to crises, but as participants shaping direction. They requested deeper briefings, challenged assumptions, asked uncomfortable questions, politely, persistently. They didn't want another blind spot. One of the first decisions made was to restructure decision authority. No single executive would hold the concentration of influence that Victor once did. Approvals were redistributed across functions. Risk assessment became mandatory, not optional. It was an admission, even if unspoken. Trust without verification had failed. I felt the shift personally. Not in applause or acknowledgement, but in expectation. People started asking for my input earlier. Not as an afterthought, but as part of planning. Documents came to me before being finalized. Questions were phrased differently. What do you think? Does this align with policy? Are we covered here? These weren't favors. They were corrections. I remained careful. Visibility can be as dangerous as invisibility. Too much of either distorts perception. I didn't become outspoken. I didn't take credit. I stayed precise. The review findings weren't buried. They were integrated. Training sessions were redesigned to reflect real scenarios, not hypothetical ones. Governance became a topic people discussed openly, not as an obstacle, but as infrastructure. Still, not everyone was comfortable. Some missed the old clarity, the speed, the decisiveness. They whispered about overcorrection, about bureaucracy creeping in. They weren't wrong entirely. Control always trades speed for safety. But safety is only visible when it's missing. The market adjusted quickly. Investors welcomed the changes. Analysts praised the strengthened oversight. Confidence didn't disappear, it matured. Internally, morale stabilized. People who had once felt ignored found room to speak. Not everyone did, but enough to signal change. The board initiated leadership searches quietly. They weren't looking for a replacement personality. They were looking for a system thinker. Someone who understood that power needed limits. During this time, I was asked a question I hadn't anticipated. Not about policy. Not about process. About culture. A senior director asked how concerns were raised operationally. What stopped people from escalating issues earlier? Where fear entered the equation. It was the first time anyone had asked that question seriously. I answered honestly, but neutrally. Culture hadn't been hostile. It had been directional. People weren't afraid of retaliation. They were afraid of irrelevance. Challenging authority had felt like slowing momentum. Like being the only one raising a hand while everyone else surged forward. Silence had been rewarded by progress. That dynamic takes time to unlearn. Change didn't arrive all at once. But it arrived. One policy at a time. One conversation at a time. New leaders stepped in, not with fanfare, but with caution. They listened more than they spoke. Asked questions before making declarations. That was intentional. They had seen what certainty without scrutiny could do. My role continued to evolve. Responsibilities expanded into governance advisory territory. Still unofficial. Still unannounced. But real. I wasn't promoted publicly. That too was intentional. The company had learned that symbols matter. Quiet effectiveness was safer than visible elevation. And that was fine. I had never needed the title. What mattered was that the work I had done could now be done by others, without fear. That was the true measure of success. One afternoon, long after the noise had faded, I passed Victor's old office. It was empty. The door open. The desk cleared. No trace of the authority that once filled the room. Just space. That image stayed with me. Because it captured something essential. Power doesn't disappear, it vacates. And when it does, it leaves behind questions. Who decides now? Who is accountable? Who speaks when something feels wrong? Those questions were no longer rhetorical. They were operational. The company wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was aware. And awareness is the one thing unchecked power can't survive. As the months passed, the crisis became a case study. Not publicly. Internally. Not about an individual, but about a failure of balance. People stopped asking how it happened. They started asking how to prevent it. That was progress. I didn't think about the past much anymore. Not out of denial, but because it no longer held weight. The outcome had settled. The system had corrected. And in the quiet that followed, I understood something deeply. Revenge is loud. Accountability is silent. And silence, when it comes from alignment with the rules, is the most permanent form of change. Time has a way of stripping stories down to what actually mattered. Months after everything settled, the company no longer felt like the place it had been. Not because the walls changed or the people were entirely different, but because the assumptions were. Decisions were slower, yes, but they were steadier. Confidence still existed, but it was grounded. Authority was exercised with awareness instead of entitlement. The absence of crisis revealed the real outcome. No one talked about Victor anymore. Not because his impact was erased, but because the system no longer revolved around a single name. Processes worked without needing force. Governance wasn't something people braced against, it was something they leaned on. That was the quiet victory. The board finalized its reforms and moved on. Oversight became routine rather than reactive. Risk discussions were expected, not disruptive. People learned that raising concerns didn't stall progress, it protected it. New leadership took shape slowly. Not one figure, but a group. They didn't lead with certainty. They led with questions. And that tone echoed downward, changing how conversations unfolded at every level. I watched it happen without stepping into the center of it. That choice mattered. Stories like this often end with recognition. A promotion. A reveal. Some moment where the underestimated figure is finally seen. This wasn't that kind of story. What I gained wasn't visibility. It was permanence. The changes put in place didn't depend on me anymore. They were embedded. Written into policy. Reinforced by culture. That was the point. Power that depends on one person can always be removed. Power that lives in systems outlasts everyone. Occasionally, someone new would ask about the past. Why certain approvals now required extra review, why escalation paths were structured the way they were. The answers were always procedural. No names. No drama. Just lessons. I stayed in my role longer than expected. Not because I had to, but because the work mattered. Mentoring became part of it. Not formally, but through example. I showed people how to document clearly. How to question without accusation. How to let the rules do the talking. Those skills were contagious. The culture continued to evolve. Not into perfection, but into balance. And that balance protected everyone. One evening, as I shut down my computer and prepared to leave, I paused at my desk longer than usual. I realized something then. The moment that had changed everything, the discovery, the escalation, the meeting, none of it felt dramatic anymore. It felt inevitable. Because once you see how power actually works, you can't unsee it. It isn't loud. It isn't aggressive. It's patient. And patience, when paired with structure, always wins. I didn't defeat anyone. I didn't take anything that wasn't already there. I simply allowed the system to function as it was designed to. That was enough. When I eventually moved on, it wasn't with ceremony. Just a transition plan, a handover, and a quiet exit. The company continued. Stronger. More aware. More honest about its limits. And that's how I knew the story was complete. Not because someone fell, but because something lasting stood in their place. The lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about restraint. About knowing when to speak, and when to let the rules speak for you. And in the end, that turned out to be the most powerful move of all.